The internet, YouTube, the entire chess community went crazy when this game was played. It was from the Speed Chess Championship. It was played between Wesley So and Alireza Firouzja. And they had played a very intense match with a lot of emotional swings and backs and forth. And they had an Armageddon game to break their tie. And in Armageddon, both sides choose a time they're willing to play with. And whoever bids the lowest time, they get that time. The other side will get 5 minutes. But the person that bids the lower time gets the black pieces and draw odds. And in this case, Alireza Firouzja bid 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Wesley So bid 3 minutes and 48 seconds. So Alireza won the bid. So Alireza gets the black pieces with draw odds in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Wesley So gets 5 minutes, and there's no increment. So when time runs out, you lose. And the game is really brilliant and has an amazing, amazing move in it. I want you to check this out. E4, played by Wesley So as he had white. E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop C4, knight F6, D3, and bishop to C5. A standard Italian game. And remember, Alireza, if he gets a draw, he wins the match. So he's okay with a drawn position. Both sides castle. And here Wesley So plays a rare and very modern idea, A4 immediately. That's the seventh most popular move. Far more common are moves like C3, prepare D4, or even the immediate bishop to G5. But A4, gaining space on the queen side, was his decision. D6, and now bishop to E3, more common again is C3. After bishop to E3, it's already a novelty in my database. Now, it does transpose into known positions a little bit later, but he's already seeking to play original positions, and we're familiar with this concept, I'm sure. After bishop takes, bishop pawn takes, white has sort of a ready-made plan. Queen E1, H4, then I can go to H4, F5. Got the half-open F-file to work on. So black usually doesn't want to do that. So Firouzja instead plays the bishop back to B6. The knight goes to D2, H6, and finally C3, the traditional idea in the Italian game, controlling D4. Prepares D4, but also it prepares a B4 push, gaining space on the queen side. Here, Firouzja plays knight to G4, hitting that bishop on E3 and basically forcing the exchange of bishops under conditions that are better for black than the ones we saw earlier. Also, by the way, it does clear the way for this f-pawn to advance, which later on could be a possibility. Bishop takes B6, AB6, and D4. Wesley So builds a nice full pawn center, pawns at D4 and E4. Rook to E8, Firouzja is putting pressure on that E4 pawn. Rook to E1, defending. Knight to F6, adding to the defense of that pawn. The knight wasn't doing anything on G4 anymore. And now bishop to B5. So now we have a tactical threat. Wesley So is threatening to play D5, attacking the pinned knight and winning the exchange with the rook sitting on E8. So now Alireza plays bishop to D7 to relieve that pin. And so far, the game is fairly equal. Wesley So is a little bit better because of the space of the A4 pawn and the D4 and E4 pawns, but it's not too much. Alireza is probably pretty happy here. H3, now knight to E7, not only seeking the exchange of pieces, getting closer to what he hopes will be a draw at least, but also maneuvering the knight to G6 and possibly F4 for an attack. Bishop takes D7, and here it would be a mistake to take with the queen, because after pawn takes, the knight at, the pawn at E5 would hang, and Wesley So would win that pawn. So he goes ahead and takes with the knight, keeping that pawn at E5 defended. But now knight to F1. Both sides are following this very standard maneuver of moving the knight to G3 or G6, F4, F5. Knight goes back to G6, aiming at F4, knight to G3, aiming at F5. All, so far, fairly standard stuff. And again, the only real advantage is Wesley So's slight space advantage. The knight returns to F6, and queen to C2 is played, adding to the defense of the E4 pawn, but also beginning another idea, sort of another modern idea, and that's to actually support the advance of the C4 pawn, almost creating a type of Maroczy bind type structure is his idea. Very unique, very modern idea. Queen to D7, and now C4. Continuing to gain space, just incrementally trying to improve his position step by step. If pawn takes on D4, then knight D4, and now he has two knights aiming at the F5 square, as well as a nice space advantage in the center. So Alireza does not do that. Instead, he plays knight to H7. Remember, he wants a draw, or at least a draw, He wins the match if he gets one. So he's seeking to exchange pieces. Now this knight can go to g5 and offer the exchange of the knight at f3. Wesley So plays queen to d2, keeping his queen aiming at that square, so that now knight to g5 isn't so easy to play. If knight g5, then takes, pawn takes, ed4, b3, c5. It looks like black would be doing very well with the protected passer on d4, but actually after f4, the combinations of the move f5 and knight to h5, aiming at g7, would be very, very strong, and white would just be better. However, queen to d2 is a mistake. Wesley So has blundered with this move because he has left his a4 pawn hanging, and Alireza Firouzja immediately grabs it, and now black has an advantage. b3 hits the rook. The rook could exchange on a1, and this is the approach preferred by the computers, but instead he plays the rook to e6. The idea is he wants to double, and if white exchanges on a6, it would heal the pawn structure, like no more double pawns, basically. So after rook to a6, de5 is played by Wesley So. Obviously, if you take with the pawn, you'd lose the queen, so he takes with the knight. And now knight to d4. A very powerful move, again, aiming at this f5 square. And he does have a nice space advantage, even though he is down a pawn. The knight goes to f6, rook a to d1. Wesley So centralizes his pieces, puts some pressure opposite the queen. Knight to g6. Again, he could come in to the, well, not yet to the f4 square, but aiming there later. Now knight d to f5. And the threat here is to just take on g7. After king to g7, knight to f5 check, king g8, queen h6 with threats of mate on g7. And that would be decisive. He'd have to give up his queen to not get mated. So what Firouzja does is he plays the move rook to a5. And now, if knight takes g7, king g7, knight f5, he would retake with the rook, getting the two minors in exchange for the rook. After ef5, rook e1 check, rook takes, queen f5. Two knights and a pawn. Black is really just winning in this position. Two knights for the rook, excuse me. Black is really just winning in this position. But after rook to a5, f4 is played by Wesley So, with the threat perhaps of going e5 and taking advantage of this pin along the d file against the queen on d7. So Firouzja steps out of the way of that pin, and now Firouzja is really aiming at that e-pawn. He's threatening to take it, and Wesley So just moves the king, gets it out of the way so there are no checks, the queen can't check on c5, what have you, and now knight to e4, and Firouzja has grabbed a second pawn in this position, so things are looking very good for him. Queen to d4, knight to f6, retreating the knight. Now, black has played well up to this point and has a slightly better position. Even though he's up two pawns, white does have quite a bit of pressure, and Alireza has to be careful. And here, Wesley So plays rook takes e8. Now, just a heads up, the right response for black here is knight takes e8, and we'll see why that was the better move here in a second. One thing it does do is defend the g7 square. But in response, he plays what is a much more natural-looking move, queen takes e8. This feels like the right move, but here, the commentators, Daniel Naroditsky among them, and the Grandmaster Hess also, I think, was the other commentator, we're looking at this position, and all of a sudden, Naroditsky said, apparently Wesley So can play this move. He said apparently, which makes you think he was probably looking at a computer at the time, although he's certainly strong enough to find a move like this over the board. And it turns out white has a crushing blow in this position, but it is not easy to find. You know, if you play knight takes g7, king g7, and then you play knight to f5 check, the rook can just take the knight. So black is totally winning in that position. So what is the tactical shot that white has? Well, when Wesley So played it, the chat just went ballistic. And it is this move, knight to g7, the one we were just looking at. And here's why it works. After king g7, as played in the game, you don't play the knight to f5. Instead, you play the move b4. And look at this. every single square along the 5th rank is covered. Anywhere the rook goes, it is going to be captured. There is nothing he can do, and that forces the rook away from the f5 square. Alireza plays rook to a2, aiming at the g2 pawn, and now Wesley So plays knight to f5 check, pushing the king away from the knight on f6 and creating other mating patterns. The king goes to f8. Wesley So plays queen to f6. Queen to e2 with the threat of mate on g2 is played, but now queen to d8 check. That forces the queen back because the king can't move. The knight covers the g7 square. The queen comes back, queen to f6, queen to e2, and of course, Alireza would be happy with a draw, so Wesley So cannot allow that. Queen d8, queen to e8. This time, he plays queen takes c7, and he's also threatening to take the pawn on d6 with check. So here, Alireza, in a desperate attempt to save the game and create a perpetual check, plays rook takes g2, check, king takes g2, knight to f4 check, king g3, knight to h5, and king to f3. And now we see there are no checks. There are no checks from the knight, and any check from the queen would just be immediately captured by white. And in this position, Alireza Firouzja resigned, and Wesley So won the match. A brilliant move from Wesley So, and one of the few games on this channel that Alireza Firouzja was not the victor. So if anybody thinks I only cover his victories, look at this game. A brilliant game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.